The Clone Wars had already rewritten the meaning of destruction across the galaxy, stretching the resolve of the Jedi Order and grinding entire systems into dust beneath the endless march of battle droids and clone legions. Yet even in this era of constant war, there were still rules, unspoken truths that governed life, death, and the invisible current of the Force that bound everything together. Ships emerged from hyperspace with predictable signatures, soldiers fell and did not rise again, and even the most powerful Force users understood that death, however tragic, was final. But on a war-scarred world deep within the Outer Rim, where the sky burned with streaks of blaster fire and the ground trembled under artillery bombardment, those rules shattered in a single, impossible moment that no Jedi foresight had predicted and no Sith manipulation had orchestrated. The battlefield stretched across miles of fractured terrain, a once thriving colony now reduced to scorched metal and shattered stone, where squads of clone troopers advanced methodically under the command of a Jedi general, their white armor stained with ash and the smell of ionized air clinging to every breath. Overhead, Republic gunships roared through the smoke-choked sky, exchanging fire with Separatist vulture droids that darted like predators through the haze, their movements sharp and mechanical as they targeted anything that moved below. The rhythm of war was relentless, a symphony of blaster fire, explosions, and shouted orders that had become disturbingly familiar to those who fought it. And yet, in the midst of that chaos, something new began to unfold, something that did not belong. At first, it was nothing more than a distortion, a ripple in the air high above the battlefield that flickered like heat-bending light, subtle enough to be dismissed as atmospheric interference or a malfunctioning sensor reading. But then the ripple deepened, widening into a jagged tear that cut across the sky with violent intensity, crackling with energy that no Republic scanner could identify and no droid intelligence could classify. It was not hyperspace. It was not the Force as the Jedi understood it. It was something else entirely, something that felt wrong. The clones noticed it first as a shift in the air, a sudden pressure that pressed against their armor and made their movements feel heavier, slower, as though the very environment resisted them. Blaster fire faltered for a fraction of a second as soldiers on both sides hesitated, their instincts reacting to something they could not see or explain. Even the Jedi leading the charge felt it, a disturbance in the Force that did not ripple like a tremor but instead pulsed like a foreign heartbeat, alien and incomprehensible. It was not darkness, not light, but something beyond those familiar definitions, something that refused to align with the balance they had spent their lives trying to understand. And then the sky broke open. A blinding surge of energy erupted from the tear, cascading downward in a torrent of luminous force that struck the battlefield with explosive impact, throwing clones and droids alike from their positions and carving a crater into the shattered earth below. The sound was unlike anything heard before, a deep, resonant shockwave that seemed to echo not just through the air but through the mind itself, as though reality had been momentarily rewritten and forced back into place. Smoke and debris filled the air, obscuring the impact site, and for a brief, suspended moment, the battlefield fell silent. Then movement returned. Through the settling dust, shapes began to emerge, figures clad in armor unlike anything the Republic had ever encountered, their forms illuminated by faint, shifting glows of energy that pulsed across their suits in hues of gold, violet, and electric blue. They rose from the crater not with confusion or hesitation, but with immediate awareness, their movements precise, controlled, as though they had landed in the middle of a war and instantly understood what that meant. Weapons materialized in their hands with flashes of light, sleek and unfamiliar, humming with power that resonated strangely against the Force itself. These were guardians. They had not arrived by choice. Torn from their own reality by a violent rupture of paracausal energy, they had been thrown into a galaxy that operated on different laws, where the light they wielded responded unpredictably to an environment saturated with the Force. Their ghosts, small, floating constructs of sentient light, hovered beside them, scanning the surroundings with rapid, flickering beams, struggling to interpret data that did not conform to any known parameters. Signals returned incomplete, distorted, as though this galaxy itself resisted being understood. But there was no time to process, because the war had not stopped. The moment the dust cleared enough for visibility, both sides reacted with the same conclusion: unknown hostiles. Blaster fire erupted once more, red and blue bolts tearing through the air toward the newly arrived figures, while Separatist droids recalibrated their targeting systems to prioritize the anomaly at the center of the battlefield. The clones, trained to respond without hesitation, opened fire in disciplined volleys, their commands cutting through the chaos as they attempted to contain what they believed to be a new enemy deployment. The Guardians responded instantly. Energy flared around them as they moved, faster than any human soldier should be capable of, their weapons discharging bursts of light-infused fire that tore through droid units with devastating efficiency. One Guardian surged forward, arc energy crackling along their armor as they slammed into a line of battle droids, releasing a shockwave that shattered metal bodies and sent fragments scattering across the ground. Another raised a hand, summoning void energy that coalesced into a gravitational singularity, pulling enemy units inward before collapsing in a violent explosion. To the clones watching, it was unlike anything they had ever seen. To the Jedi, it was something far more troubling. Because this power did not feel like the Force. It did not flow, did not harmonize, did not connect. It imposed. The battlefield descended into chaos as both sides struggled to adapt to this new variable, their strategies unraveling under the unpredictable actions of warriors who fought with a level of aggression and resilience that defied conventional tactics. Droids advanced in overwhelming numbers, only to be cut down by precise, relentless counterattacks. Clone troopers attempted to regroup, to establish firing lines, but found themselves disrupted by sudden bursts of energy that ignored cover and shattered formations. And then, for the first time, a Guardian fell. A concentrated volley of blaster fire struck one of them mid-advance, the impact forcing them to the ground as armor cracked and light flickered out. For a moment, everything seemed to return to normal, because death, in this galaxy, meant something final. Until it didn't. The ghost appeared instantly, its shell rotating as it emitted a focused beam of light that enveloped the fallen Guardian. Energy surged, pulsing outward in a brilliant flash, and within seconds, the Guardian rose again, fully restored, weapon already in hand, rejoining the battle as though death had been nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. The clones froze. The droids recalculated. And somewhere beyond the immediate battlefield, a Jedi felt it, and knew that something had entered the galaxy that would change everything. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that like button, share this video, drop the name of a character you'd want to see next in the comments below, and most importantly subscribe so you don't miss the next story. The war resumed with renewed intensity, but now it was no longer just a battle between Republic and Separatists. It had become something else entirely, a conflict that neither side understood, where death itself had lost its meaning and power no longer followed the rules it once obeyed. And as the Guardians fought, adapting in real time to the unfamiliar physics of this galaxy, their presence sent ripples far beyond the battlefield, drawing attention from forces that had been watching the war from the shadows. Because somewhere, far from the front lines, a dark presence stirred. A mind that had orchestrated the Clone Wars from its very beginning now turned its focus toward this new anomaly, sensing in it a potential that went beyond even the power of the Force. The arrival of the Guardians was not just an intrusion. It was an opportunity. And in that realization, the true consequences of their arrival began to take shape. The galaxy had not just gained new warriors. It had gained a new kind of power. One that refused to die. The battlefield did not pause to allow comprehension, nor did the galaxy grant time for reflection when something impossible took root within it. The moment the first Guardian rose from death, the war itself seemed to shift, as if the very rules governing existence had been quietly rewritten in the span of a heartbeat. Blaster fire resumed with renewed urgency, but now every shot carried uncertainty, every command carried hesitation, because what had just been witnessed could not be reconciled with anything the Republic, or the Jedi, understood about life and the Force. From the forward command ridge overlooking the shattered valley, Anakin Skywalker felt it more sharply than anyone else present. The Force, which had always flowed through him like a raging current, now stuttered with something unfamiliar, a ripple that did not belong to its natural rhythm. His gaze remained locked on the figures below, The armored warriors who moved through blaster fire with unnatural precision, their weapons flashing with energies that did not resemble plasma or ion discharge, but something deeper, something that pressed against the Force rather than blending with it. Beside him, Obi-Wan Kenobi stood in stillness, his expression composed, though his mind raced beneath that calm exterior. He had spent years interpreting disturbances in the Force, had trained himself to distinguish between fear, anger, and the subtle manipulations of the dark side. What he felt now defied those categories. It was not aggression in the traditional sense, nor was it the serene clarity of the light side. It was something foreign, a presence that existed alongside the Force, not within it. Below them, the battle surged as clone troopers attempted to re-establish their formations. Orders were shouted over comms, urgent and strained, as squads repositioned behind what little cover remained, their attention divided between advancing Separatist units and the unknown warriors who had entered the conflict without warning. Tactical overlays flickered with conflicting data, unable to properly classify the new combatants. Every protocol demanded they be treated as hostiles. And yet, the reality unfolding on the battlefield resisted simple classification. One of the Guardians moved with a speed that defied expectation, weaving through incoming fire as though guided by instinct beyond sight. Blaster bolts that should have struck true instead grazed past their armor, deflected by movements so precise they seemed almost preordained. As they closed the distance to a cluster of battle droids, energy ignited around their form, bright, radiant, and alive. With a single motion, they unleashed it, a wave of solar light that erupted outward in a controlled inferno, reducing the mechanical forces before them to molten wreckage. The clones nearest to the blast recoiled, not from fear alone, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of what they had just witnessed. They had seen Jedi fight, had seen lightsabers cut through droid ranks with elegance and precision. This was different. This was raw, overwhelming, and unrestrained. Anakin leaned forward slightly, his focus narrowing. There was power in those movements, undeniable and immense, but it was not disciplined in the way the Jedi taught. It was instinctive, immediate, as though the wielder did not need to consider balance or restraint. And yet, there was no darkness in it. No anger that he could sense. No hatred. Just action. Another Guardian fell. This time, it was not a momentary lapse but a direct hit from heavy Separatist artillery. The explosion consumed them entirely, the force of it sending debris scattering across the battlefield as both clones and droids were forced back by the blast. For a brief moment, the outcome seemed inevitable. Nothing could survive that level of destruction. And yet, once again, the impossible occurred. The ghost appeared above the crater, its small, geometric form hovering with deliberate purpose as it emitted a focused beam of radiant light. The energy gathered, intensified, and then released in a surge that seemed to ripple outward, disturbing the very fabric of the air around it. Within seconds, the Guardian stood once more, reconstructed, restored, and ready to rejoin the fight. Obi-Wan's breath caught, subtle but unmistakable. "That is not the Force," he said quietly, though his voice carried the weight of realization. Anakin did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the resurrected warrior, his thoughts racing as he tried to reconcile what he had just seen. The Jedi teachings were clear. The Force flowed through all living things. It guided life, connected it, and in time, it reclaimed it. Death was not an enemy to be defeated, but a natural transition, a return to the Force itself. But this was defiance. Then what is it? Anakin finally asked, his tone edged with something that bordered on fascination. Obi-Wan did not have an answer. Below them, the clones began to react differently. Where there had once been hesitation, there was now confusion bordering on disbelief. Reports flooded through their channels, each one confirming what had seemed impossible just moments before. The unknown combatants could not be killed, not in any permanent sense. Every loss they sustained was temporary, every setback reversed within moments. For soldiers trained to fight a war where casualties were a constant reality, the implications were staggering. Morale shifted, not upward, but sideways, into something uncertain. Some clones pressed forward with renewed determination, inspired by the presence of allies who could not fall permanently. Others hesitated, unsettled by the unnatural nature of what they were witnessing. War had rules, even in its brutality. This broke them. The Separatists adapted in their own way. Droid commanders recalibrated their tactics with mechanical efficiency, prioritizing suppression over elimination, focusing fire not just on the Guardians themselves but on the small floating constructs that accompanied them. Sensors began to lock onto the ghosts, identifying them as key variables in the resurrection process. If the warriors could not be killed directly, then perhaps their revival could be prevented. Blaster fire shifted accordingly. One ghost was struck. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The small construct shattered under concentrated fire, its light flickering out in a burst of fragmented energy that dissipated into nothingness. For the first time since their arrival, a Guardian fell and did not rise. The shift in the battlefield was instantaneous. The other Guardians reacted with a level of intensity that surpassed even their previous actions. Movements became sharper, more aggressive, their focus narrowing with lethal precision as they eliminated the droid units responsible with ruthless efficiency. The light they wielded flared brighter, more volatile, as though responding to loss in a way that mirrored something deeply human. Anakin felt that. Not through the Force, but alongside it. Emotion, raw and unfiltered, expressed through power that did not seek balance, did not seek harmony, but simply acted. "That changes everything," Obi-Wan said, his tone grave as he observed the aftermath. Anakin nodded slowly, though his thoughts had already moved beyond the immediate implications. His mind raced with possibilities, with questions that had no easy answers. If these warriors could defy death, if they could return again and again, then what did that mean for the war? For the Jedi? For everything they believed about the Force itself? Below, the Guardians regrouped, their formation tightening as they adapted to the new threat. Their ghosts repositioned, more cautious now, their movements calculated as they avoided incoming fire. They were learning, just as the Republic and Separatists were learning. This was not a static anomaly. It was an evolving one. And as the battle continued, as blaster fire lit the sky and the ground trembled beneath the weight of conflict, one truth became impossible to ignore. The Clone Wars had just changed. Not because of a new weapon, not because of a new strategy, but because death itself was no longer absolute. And as that realization settled over the battlefield, spreading through clone ranks, droid command protocols, and the minds of the Jedi who watched from above, the implications began to ripple outward, reaching far beyond this single world. Because if immortality had entered the war, then the balance of the Force itself was no longer certain. The consequences of what had been witnessed on that battlefield did not remain contained within its scorched atmosphere. In the hours that followed, encrypted transmissions carried fragmented reports across the Republic's vast communication network, each one marked with priority clearance and escalating urgency as commanders attempted to describe something that defied both military logic and spiritual understanding. By the time those reports reached the towering spires of Coruscant, the heart of the Republic itself, they had already begun to lose coherence under the weight of disbelief. Words like resurrection, anomaly, and unknown energy signatures repeated across multiple accounts, but none of them fully captured the reality of what had occurred. And yet, for the Jedi, it was not the words that mattered. It was the disturbance. Within the high chambers of the Jedi Council, a tension unlike any felt since the early days of the war settled into the very air. The circular room, usually a place of quiet reflection and measured debate, now felt heavy with uncertainty as masters gathered to confront a reality that none of their teachings had prepared them for. Outside the panoramic windows, Coruscant stretched endlessly, a sea of lights and motion, yet within the chamber there was stillness, an uneasy pause before something greater unfolded. Yoda sat at the center of that stillness, his eyes closed, his connection to the Force reaching outward in search of clarity. What he sensed disturbed him more than he allowed himself to show. The Force was shifting, not in darkness, not in imbalance as it had under the shadow of the Sith, but in something far more subtle. It was being interrupted. Not severed, not corrupted, but overlapped by something that did not belong, like a second current running against its flow. Around him, the other masters voiced their concerns. Mace Windu stood firm, his presence unwavering as he spoke with controlled intensity, his mind already turning toward the practical implications. An unknown force had entered the war, one that could not be easily categorized or controlled. That alone made it dangerous. The Republic could not afford unpredictability, not now, not when the war had already stretched its resources to the brink. To him, the question was not philosophical. It was strategic. "They are a variable we do not understand," he stated, his tone resolute. "And in war, what we do not understand can destroy us." Others were less certain. Obi-Wan stood among them, his earlier composure now shaped by first-hand experience. He recounted what he and Anakin had witnessed, not as speculation, but as fact. The resurrection, the ghosts, the way their power felt separate from the Force itself. He spoke not with alarm, but with careful consideration, emphasizing what he did not know as much as what he did. "They do not draw upon the Force as we do," he explained, his voice steady. "And yet, they wield something that rivals it." That statement lingered in the chamber. Because it was not just a description. It was a challenge. Anakin, standing nearby, did not wait for permission to speak. His thoughts, unlike Obi-Wan's measured restraint, burned with urgency. He had felt their power directly, had seen the way they moved, the way they fought, the way they refused to remain dead. There was something undeniably effective about them, something that could change the course of the war if understood properly. "They're not our enemies," he said, his tone firm, though edged with impatience. "They were fighting the Separatists. They didn't hesitate. Whatever they are, they're not aligned with Dooku." At the mention of Count Dooku, several masters exchanged glances. The Sith were always at the center of the war's deeper mysteries, their influence shaping events from the shadows. If these new warriors were not aligned with them, then that raised another question. Who are they aligned with? Yoda opened his eyes slowly, his gaze moving between the assembled Jedi as he considered the weight of what had been said. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but carried the authority of centuries. "Not enemies, perhaps," he said, "but understood they are not." Silence followed. Because that was the truth at the center of it all. The Guardians, though the Jedi did not yet know that name, were not enemies in the traditional sense. But neither were they allies. They had entered the war without allegiance, without explanation, and without any indication that they intended to follow the structures that governed the galaxy. And that made them unpredictable. Far from Coruscant, on worlds scattered across the outer rim, that unpredictability was already taking shape. The Guardians did not wait for permission. They did not seek orders. They moved. Small fire teams broke away from the original impact site, their ghosts guiding them through unfamiliar star systems as they adapted rapidly to the mechanics of hyperspace travel within this new galaxy. Republic and Separatist forces alike began to report sightings, brief, chaotic encounters where unknown armored warriors intervened in active battles, tipping the scales in ways that defied conventional tactics before vanishing just as quickly as they had appeared. On one world, a Guardian strike disrupted a Separatist supply line, obliterating an entire convoy with precision strikes that left droid forces scrambling to respond. On another, a fire team intervened in a Republic retreat, holding off overwhelming numbers long enough for clone forces to regroup and escape certain destruction. There was no pattern to their actions, no clear alignment that could be tracked or predicted. They chose their own battles. And that choice unsettled everyone. To the Republic, they were potential allies, but unreliable ones. To the Separatists, they were a threat, but not one that could be easily countered. To the Jedi, they were something else entirely. A question. Because the Guardians were not guided by the Force as the Jedi understood it. They did not seek balance, did not meditate on the will of the Force, did not adhere to the philosophies that had shaped the Order for generations. They acted with purpose, but that purpose came from within, not from an external guiding energy. They did not ask what the Force willed. They decided. And in doing so, they introduced something the galaxy had not seen in a very long time. True independence. Back on Coruscant, the Council reached no immediate conclusion. They could not. The situation was too new, too fluid, too uncertain. To declare the Guardians allies would be to trust something they did not understand. To declare them enemies would be to risk pushing a powerful new force into opposition. So they chose caution. Observation. But even as that decision was made, it was already becoming clear that observation alone would not be enough. Because the Guardians were not waiting to be understood. They were already changing the war. And as their presence spread across system after system, leaving behind disrupted battles, altered outcomes, and unanswered questions, one truth became impossible to ignore. The Clone Wars were no longer being fought by two sides. There was a third force now. One that did not belong to the Republic. One that did not serve the Separatists. And one that answered to no one but itself. The war had always been a contest of adaptation. Strategies evolved, weapons advanced, and tactics shifted with each new engagement, but at its core, the Clone Wars had followed a predictable pattern shaped by the careful manipulation of forces behind the scenes. That pattern, however, had begun to fracture. The arrival of the Guardians had introduced a variable that could not be easily accounted for, and while the Republic struggled to understand it, there were others who saw not confusion, but opportunity. Far from the polished halls of Coruscant, deep within the shadowed territories of the Separatist alliance, Count Dooku stood before a holographic projection of a battlefield report, his expression calm, but his thoughts sharpened by intrigue. The flickering blue image depicted fragments of recorded combat, armored figures moving with impossible speed, unleashing energies that did not align with known technology or the Force as it was traditionally understood. But it was not their combat efficiency that held his attention. It was their refusal to remain dead. The recording looped, showing a Guardian falling beneath concentrated fire, only to rise again moments later, restored through the intervention of the small floating construct identified by Separatist analysts as a core unit. The data accompanying the footage was incomplete, inconsistent, and at times contradictory, but the conclusion was undeniable. They had conquered death. Dooku's gaze narrowed slightly as he considered the implications. For decades, both Jedi and Sith had pursued deeper understanding of life and its inevitable end, each approaching it from opposing philosophies. The Jedi accepted death as part of the Force's natural cycle, while the Sith sought to dominate it, to bend it to their will through forbidden knowledge and raw power. Yet even the most powerful Sith Lords had never truly achieved what these beings displayed so effortlessly. Resurrection. Not through ritual. Not through manipulation of the Force. But through something else entirely. Fascinating, Dooku murmured, his voice low, measured, carrying the quiet satisfaction of a mind encountering something worthy of its attention. Behind him, battle droids stood in silent readiness, their photoreceptors dim as they awaited instruction, while tactical displays continued to update with new reports from across the Outer Rim. Sightings of the Guardians were increasing, their presence no longer isolated to a single system but spreading across multiple fronts, disrupting both Republic and Separatist operations with equal unpredictability. They were not aligned. That, in itself, made them dangerous. But it also made them vulnerable. Because beings without allegiance could be influenced, guided, controlled. Dooku turned away from the hologram, his cloak shifting with the movement as he approached a larger strategic display, where the flow of the war was mapped in shifting lines of blue and red. His mind moved beyond simple observation, already forming a plan that extended far beyond the immediate conflict. If these Guardians could be understood, if their power could be studied, dissected, and ultimately harnessed, then the balance of the war would shift irrevocably. And beyond that, something greater awaited. He did not need to voice it. The desire to transcend death was not a new ambition among the Sith. But this was different. This was not an extension of the Force. It was an alternative. And that made it priceless. Locate them, Dooku commanded, his tone calm but absolute. Identify patterns in their movements. Predict where they will appear next. The droids responded instantly, their systems processing the order with mechanical precision as data streams shifted, recalculating probabilities based on recent encounters. Patterns began to emerge, not perfect, but enough to suggest areas of increased activity, regions where the Guardians seemed to favor intervention. battlefields where the conflict was most intense, where the stakes were highest, where their presence would have the greatest impact. Dooku allowed himself a faint, knowing smile. Then that was where he would set his trap. Days later, on a contested world caught between Republic defense lines and advancing Separatist forces, the stage was set. The planet's surface was a wasteland of jagged rock formations and deep ravines, its skies perpetually choked with storm clouds that crackled with electrical energy, casting the battlefield below in intermittent flashes of harsh, unnatural light. Droid armies advanced in calculated formations, their movements precise, coordinated, designed to draw Republic forces into a prolonged engagement. It was a lure, and it worked. Republic forces responded with equal determination, deploying clone troopers and Jedi commanders to hold the line against the advancing Separatist assault. The battle escalated rapidly, blaster fire illuminating the darkened landscape as explosions tore through the terrain, sending plumes of dust and debris into the already volatile atmosphere. And then, as expected, the Guardians arrived. They did not emerge from hyperspace in the conventional sense. Instead, they appeared as they had before, through sudden distortions in space, brief ruptures that deposited them directly into the heart of conflict. 3 of them this time, their armor gleaming faintly beneath the storm-lit sky as their ghosts hovered nearby, scanning the environment with rapid pulses of light. They assessed the situation instantly. Separatist forces pushing aggressively. Republic defenses faltering. No hesitation followed. They moved. Arc energy surged as one Guardian launched forward, crashing into a line of advancing droids with explosive force, electricity chaining between targets as mechanical units convulsed and collapsed under the assault. Another raised their weapon, firing bursts of void-infused energy that tore through enemy ranks, creating pockets of gravitational distortion that disrupted formations and slowed incoming attacks. To the clones fighting nearby, their arrival was both a relief and a source of unease. To the droids, it was a recalculation. To Dooku, it was confirmation. He watched from a concealed vantage point, his presence masked within the chaos of battle, his connection to the Force carefully restrained as he observed the Guardians in action. He did not engage immediately. That was not his purpose. He studied their movements, their coordination, the way their ghosts hovered just beyond direct engagement, maintaining proximity while avoiding unnecessary exposure. They were not reckless. They were efficient, which meant they could be anticipated. Dooku extended his awareness through the Force, not to influence, but to perceive. He reached toward the nearest Guardian, expecting resistance, expecting some form of connection he could manipulate or exploit. But what he found instead was absence. Not emptiness, not void, but something that existed outside the framework of the Force itself. He could sense them physically, could track their movements, but their power, the source of their resurrection, their abilities, remained beyond his grasp. For the first time in many years, Count Dooku encountered something he could not immediately understand. And that only deepened his resolve. The trap was sprung without warning. Heavy Separatist artillery, previously held in reserve, unleashed a concentrated barrage that forced both Republic and Guardian forces into defensive positions. The terrain itself became a weapon, collapsing under sustained bombardment as droid reinforcements surged forward, their objective no longer victory, but containment. Specifically, containment of one target. A Guardian was isolated. Their fire teams split by the sudden shift in terrain, cut off by collapsing rock formations and advancing droid units that converged with relentless precision. Blaster fire intensified, not aimed at destruction, but at suppression, forcing the Guardian into constant movement, denying them the opportunity to regroup. Their ghost darted nearby, weaving through incoming fire as it attempted to maintain position. That was when Dooku moved. He stepped into the battlefield with calm authority, his presence cutting through the chaos like a blade. The Force surged around him, not in reckless display, but in controlled, focused intent as he extended his hand toward the isolated Guardian. The ghost reacted instantly, but it was too late. Invisible pressure closed around it, seizing it mid-flight as Dooku's power enveloped the construct, suspending it in place despite its attempts to break free. Light flickered erratically across its surface, destabilized under the influence of something it was not designed to resist. The Guardian turned, their reaction immediate, their weapon raising as they attempted to intervene. Dooku's other hand moved with effortless precision. Force lightning erupted. Not in wild arcs, but in controlled streams that struck the Guardian directly, overwhelming their defenses and driving them to their knees as energy coursed through their armor. The light within them flared in response, resisting, adapting, but for the moment, it was not enough. The battlefield seemed to pause. Because in that moment, something unprecedented had occurred. A Guardian had been captured. Not killed. Not destroyed. But restrained. Dooku stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the struggling warrior before him, while the ghost remained suspended at his side, its light flickering under the strain of his control. At last, he spoke, his voice calm, measured, carrying the weight of inevitability. Now, we will learn. And as the storm raged above and the battle continued around them, the true danger of the Guardians' arrival began to take shape. Because they were no longer just a mystery. They were now a target. The capture of a Guardian did not slow the war. It accelerated it. What had once been a conflict defined by attrition and strategy now began to unravel into something far less predictable, as if the galaxy itself had lost its understanding of consequence. Reports of the encounter spread rapidly through both Republic and Separatist channels, each faction interpreting the event through their own lens of fear, ambition, and opportunity. But while Count Dooku turned his attention toward unlocking the secrets of the light, the rest of the galaxy faced a far more immediate reality. The Guardians did not retreat. If anything, they became more active. Across multiple systems, their presence intensified, no longer limited to isolated interventions but expanding into decisive engagements that reshaped entire battles. Fire teams began appearing at critical moments, their timing almost unervingly precise, as though guided by an instinct that transcended conventional strategy. Republic commanders who had once treated them as unpredictable anomalies now found themselves relying on their sudden appearances, even if they could not predict when, or they would arrive. On a contested world along a vital hyperspace corridor, a Republic fleet found itself outmaneuvered by a superior Separatist force. Star destroyers exchanged fire with waves of droid-controlled frigates, their shields buckling under sustained bombardment as squadrons of vulture droids overwhelmed Republic starfighters in a relentless assault. The outcome seemed inevitable. Reinforcements were too far away. Retreat would mean losing control of the system entirely. And then the Guardians arrived. Not in ships. Not through hyperspace. But through the same violent distortions that had first marked their entry into the galaxy. Rifts tore open in the vacuum of space itself, brief flashes of impossible energy that deposited armored figures directly onto the hulls of Separatist vessels. Magnetic boots locked instantly as the Guardians moved with practiced efficiency, their weapons discharging bursts of light-infused energy that cut through droid defenders with brutal precision. Explosions rippled across the exterior of the ships as critical systems were sabotaged from within, their coordination seamless despite the alien nature of their environment. Inside one Separatist cruiser, a Guardian moved through corridors filled with battle droids, their arc energy surging outward in waves that overloaded circuitry and sent mechanical bodies collapsing in sparks and twisted metal. Blaster fire struck them repeatedly, forcing them back as their armor absorbed the impacts, until one direct hit finally brought them down. For a moment, the droids advanced. Then the ghost appeared, light flared, and the Guardian rose again. That moment, captured on tactical feeds and transmitted across both fleets, changed everything. Because now, the war was no longer about winning engagements. It was about understanding how to fight something that refused to stay dead. Republic commanders began to adapt first, their strategies shifting to incorporate the Guardians' unpredictable interventions. Instead of relying solely on defensive formations, they began leaving openings, calculated risks designed to draw Separatist forces into positions where a sudden Guardian strike could cause maximum disruption. It was not a strategy built on certainty, but on possibility. And it worked. But it also came at a cost. Because the Guardians were not under Republic command. They did not answer to orders. They chose where they fought and why. On another world, deep within Separatist-controlled territory, a Republic outpost was abandoned when reinforcements failed to arrive. Clone troopers held their ground as long as they could, their numbers dwindling under relentless assault until retreat became the only option. No Guardians came to their aid. No rift opened in the sky. No light intervened. For those who survived, the realization was stark. The Guardians were not saviors. They were participants. Unpredictable ones. The Separatists adapted in their own way. Droid command protocols evolved rapidly, incorporating new directives that prioritized not just the elimination of Guardians, but the neutralization of their ghosts. Specialized units were deployed with enhanced targeting algorithms, designed to isolate and destroy the floating constructs before they could initiate resurrection. Heavy weapons were recalibrated, their firing patterns adjusted to overwhelm even the rapid response capabilities of the ghosts. It was no longer enough to kill. They had to prevent return. Battles grew more chaotic as both sides adjusted to this new reality. Engagements that would have ended in decisive victories now stretched into prolonged conflicts, their outcomes shifting unpredictably as Guardians intervened, withdrew, and returned again. Entire campaigns were thrown into disarray as carefully planned operations collapsed under the weight of variables that could not be controlled. And through it all, the Jedi watched. From the front lines, Anakin Skywalker found himself both frustrated and intrigued by the Guardians' presence. Their power was undeniable, their effectiveness unquestionable, but their refusal to align with the Republic made them unreliable allies at best. He had fought alongside them more than once now, witnessing firsthand their ability to turn the tide of battle in moments, and yet, each time, they vanished before any real understanding could be reached. "They fight like soldiers," he remarked during one debriefing, his tone edged with impatience. "But they don't follow orders. They don't even try to coordinate." Obi-Wan Kenobi considered that carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps they are not soldiers in the way we understand," he replied. "Their priorities may not align with ours." Anakin frowned slightly at that, his gaze drifting toward the distant horizon where another battle raged. "Then what are they doing here?" It was a question that had no easy answer. Because the Guardians themselves were still adapting. Their ghosts continued to struggle with the unique properties of the Star Wars galaxy, their ability to process information hindered by the pervasive presence of the Force, which interfered subtly with their scanning capabilities. Resurrection still functioned, but not always with perfect consistency. In areas where the Force was particularly strong, delays occurred, moments where the light seemed to hesitate, as though encountering resistance it could not fully overcome. The Guardians noticed. They adapted. Fire teams began adjusting their tactics, protecting their ghosts more carefully, coordinating their movements with greater precision as they accounted for the evolving threats against them. They learned to anticipate droid targeting patterns, to prioritize threats not just to themselves, but to the source of their immortality. Because now that immortality had limits. Not permanent ones, but enough to matter. And as those limits became clearer, the nature of the war shifted once again. It was no longer just about who could survive. It was about who could adapt faster. Across the galaxy, battles escalated into something more volatile, more dangerous, as the presence of the Guardians forced every faction to rethink its approach. The Republic grew more aggressive, leveraging the chaos to reclaim lost ground. The Separatists became more calculated, focusing on containment and study rather than outright destruction. And in the shadows, other forces began to take notice. Because where war became unpredictable, opportunity followed. Smugglers, mercenaries, and syndicates operating beyond the reach of both Republic and Separatist authority began to encounter fragments of this new reality. Abandoned battlefields where strange weapons remained, where damaged ghosts flickered with residual light, where the boundaries between life and death had been tested and broken. They did not understand what they had found. But they understood value. And in a galaxy driven as much by profit as by power, that was enough. As the Guardians continued to fight, their presence spreading further with each passing cycle, one truth became impossible to ignore. The Clone Wars were no longer bound by limits. Not by strategy, not by numbers, and no longer by death. Because now, the battlefield itself had changed. And no one, not the Republic, not the Separatists, not even the Jedi or the Sith, could fully control what came next. War had always created opportunity in the shadows. While armies clashed across star systems and the fate of the Republic and Separatists dominated official narratives, there existed another layer of the galaxy that thrived precisely because of that chaos. A network of smugglers, crime syndicates, and independent operators who saw war not as a tragedy, but as a marketplace. They did not care who controlled the system or which ideology prevailed. They cared about supply, demand, and profit. And when the Guardians entered the Clone Wars, they did not just disrupt battlefields. They disrupted the economy of power itself. It began quietly, almost unnoticed amidst the escalating conflict. On worlds recently scarred by Guardian intervention, scavengers moved in after the fighting ended, picking through wreckage left behind by both Republic and Separatist forces. This was routine. War zones always yielded valuable remnants, damaged weapons, salvageable components, data cores. But this time, something new appeared among the debris. Weapons that hummed faintly with residual light. Fragments of armor that resisted conventional analysis. And most importantly, damaged ghosts. At first, these discoveries were treated like curiosities. Strange, valuable, but not fully understood. Smugglers transported them off-world, selling them through discreet channels to buyers willing to pay for anything unique. But it did not take long for the significance of these objects to become clear. Because some ghosts were not entirely destroyed. They flickered. Faint pulses of light remained within their fractured shells, their systems attempting to function despite catastrophic damage. They were not fully operational, but they were not inert either. They existed in a state between life and death, much like the Guardians they served. And that was something the underworld could not ignore. On the fringes of Hutt-controlled space, deals began to form. Hutt cartel intermediaries, always quick to exploit new opportunities, acquired several of these damaged ghosts through back channels, their interest driven not by understanding, but by potential. The Hutts did not need to comprehend the science or the philosophy behind what they had obtained. They only needed to recognize that it was rare, and that rarity meant value. Soon, whispers spread through the underworld. Objects that could bring the dead back. Machines that defied the natural order. Immortality for sale. Of course, the reality was far more complicated. Attempts to activate the ghosts failed initially. Their systems resisted external input, their light flickering erratically when tampered with, as though rejecting interference. But the underworld was nothing if not persistent. Specialists were brought in, rogue engineers, former Republic scientists, even individuals with limited force sensitivity, each attempting to unlock the secrets contained within these constructs. Progress was slow, but it was not non-existent. On a hidden station orbiting a forgotten moon, a breakthrough occurred. A team of technicians managed to stabilize a damaged ghost just long enough to trigger a partial energy discharge. The result was chaotic. A burst of light that overloaded nearby systems and nearly destroyed the station itself, but it proved something critical. The ghosts could be manipulated, not controlled, not fully understood, but influenced. And that was enough. As word spread, demand increased exponentially. Criminal syndicates that had once focused on weapons, spice, and information began shifting their priorities. Guardian technology became the most sought-after commodity in the galaxy, its value surpassing even the rarest resources. Smugglers took greater risks, venturing into active war zones not to support one side or the other, but to retrieve anything connected to the Guardians. Weapons, armor, ghosts, anything that could be sold. The consequences were immediate. Battlefields that had once been cleared by military forces were now swarmed by scavengers before the fighting had even fully ended. Smugglers operated under the cover of ongoing conflict, extracting valuable materials while Republic and Separatist forces remained locked in engagement. This not only disrupted military operations but introduced a new layer of unpredictability as unauthorized ships entered contested space with increasing frequency. The Republic attempted to respond, issuing orders to secure Guardian-related materials whenever possible. But their efforts were inconsistent, stretched thin by the demands of the war itself. They could not be everywhere at once. The Separatists, meanwhile, saw opportunity. Droid forces began incorporating retrieval protocols into their operations, collecting Guardian technology not just for destruction, but for study. These materials were transported to secure research facilities, where scientists loyal to Count Dooku continued their work, building upon the knowledge gained from the captured Guardian and Ghost. But even they struggled, because the light resisted them. It was not passive. It did not simply exist within the Ghosts. It reacted. It pushed back against attempts to control it, destabilizing systems, corrupting data, and in some cases, causing complete system failure. Unlike conventional energy sources, it could not be easily harnessed. And yet, the attempts continued, because the reward was too great to ignore. Elsewhere, the Guardians became aware of what was happening. At first, it was through scattered encounters, fire teams arriving at battle sites only to find scavengers already present, attempting to dismantle fallen equipment or retrieve damaged Ghosts. These encounters rarely ended peacefully. The Guardians did not negotiate when it came to their own. They moved with swift, decisive force, eliminating threats and reclaiming what they could. But they could not be everywhere. And for every Ghost recovered, others were lost. This forced a change in their behavior. Fire teams began operating with greater cohesion, prioritizing not just combat objectives but the protection of their Ghosts above all else. Movements became more calculated, less reactive, as they adapted to the growing threat posed not just by Republic or Separatist forces, but by the underworld itself. They were no longer just fighting a war. They were protecting their immortality. The Jedi observed these developments with increasing concern. Reports of black market activity involving Guardian technology reached Coruscant, adding yet another layer of complexity to an already unstable situation. The idea that immortality, or something resembling it, could be commodified was deeply troubling, not just strategically, but philosophically. This is a path we cannot allow to continue, Mace Windu stated during a council briefing, his tone carrying a rare edge of urgency. If these artifacts fall into the wrong hands in greater numbers, the consequences could be catastrophic. Obi-Wan agreed, though his concerns extended beyond the immediate threat. We are dealing with something that does not belong to our understanding of the Force, he said. And yet, others are attempting to use it as if it were a tool. That alone is dangerous. Anakin, however, saw it differently. Or inevitable, he countered, his gaze steady. Power like that was always going to attract attention. The question isn't whether people will try to use it. It's whether anyone actually can. That question remained unanswered. Because while the underworld had begun to unlock fragments of Guardian technology, they had not yet replicated its core function. Resurrection remained beyond their reach, the light resisting full control in ways that no one could fully explain. But they were getting closer. And in a galaxy already consumed by war, that proximity was enough to push everything further toward chaos. Trade routes shifted, not just for military advantage, but to facilitate the movement of these new, highly valuable commodities. Alliances within the underworld fractured and reformed as different factions competed for access to Guardian technology. Violence increased, not just between Republic and Separatist forces, but within the criminal networks themselves. The war was spreading, not just across systems, but into every layer of the galaxy. And as the Guardians continued to fight, adapting to a conflict that had grown far beyond its original scope, they began to understand something that even the Jedi had not fully grasped. Their presence was not just changing the war. It was changing everything. Because immortality, once introduced, could not remain contained. And now, it was no longer just theirs. The war had always tested the Jedi, but never like this. For generations, the Jedi Order had defined itself through balance, discipline, and an unwavering trust in the will of the Force. Even as the Clone Wars forced them into roles as generals and commanders, positions that blurred the line between peacekeepers and soldiers, they had held onto one fundamental truth, that life and death were part of a greater cycle, one that could not be dominated without consequence. But now, that truth was under siege, not by the Sith, not by the Separatists, but by something far more disruptive. The Guardians. They had not merely altered the battlefield. They had introduced a contradiction so profound that it reached into the very core of Jedi philosophy and began to unravel it from within. Because if death could be defied, if life could be restored repeatedly without the guidance of the Force, then what did that mean for everything the Jedi believed? Within the high chambers of the Jedi Council, that question had become impossible to ignore. The Council had convened more frequently in recent cycles, each meeting heavier than the last, as reports from across the galaxy painted an increasingly unstable picture. Guardian interventions were growing more frequent, more decisive. Entire battles had shifted in moments because of their presence. Republic casualties had decreased in areas where they appeared, while Separatist forces struggled to maintain consistent control against an enemy that could not be permanently eliminated. From a purely strategic standpoint, the conclusion seemed obvious. The Guardians could help end the war. Faster. More efficiently. With fewer losses. But the Force was not a tool to be measured solely in outcomes. And that was where the conflict began. Mace Windu stood at the center of the chamber, his presence grounded, his voice carrying the weight of certainty shaped by years of discipline and experience. He did not speak with hesitation because to him, the path forward was clear, not easy, but clear. They represent a power outside the Force, he stated, his tone firm, deliberate. One that disrupts the balance we are sworn to protect. We cannot allow ourselves to become dependent on it. Around him, several masters nodded in agreement. The Jedi had already compromised much in this war. They had taken command of armies, engaged in direct combat on a scale unseen in generations, and placed themselves at the center of a conflict that strained their connection to the Force. To now embrace something that defied the natural order entirely would be a step beyond anything they had faced before. But not all agreed. Obi-Wan Kenobi stood among them, his expression thoughtful, his mind balancing caution with observation. He had seen the Guardians in action, had fought alongside them, had witnessed their impact not just on the battlefield, but on the soldiers who fought beside them. He understood the danger they represented, but he also understood the reality of the war. They are not an ideology, he said carefully. They are not a philosophy. They are individuals. They make choices. And those choices, more often than not, have saved lives. That distinction mattered, because the Guardians were not a unified force in the way the Jedi or Sith were. They did not follow a shared doctrine. They did not seek to impose a singular vision upon the galaxy. They acted independently, guided by their own sense of purpose, their own interpretation of what needed to be done. That made them unpredictable, but it also made them relatable. To some, Anakin Skywalker did not wait for the Council's consensus to form before stepping forward, his presence cutting through the measured restraint of the chamber with the intensity that had always set him apart. His connection to the Force was powerful, but his perspective had never been confined by tradition alone. He had seen too much, lost too much, to accept limitations without question. "We're losing people every day," he said, his voice steady but charged with underlying emotion. "Clones. Civilians. Entire systems. And we're standing here debating whether or not to use something that could stop that." Mace Windu's gaze shifted toward him, unyielding. "At what cost?" Anakin did not hesitate. "The cost is already being paid." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Because they were true. The war had already demanded sacrifices the Jedi had never intended to make. They had justified those sacrifices in the name of the greater good, in the hope that their actions would ultimately restore balance. But now, the Guardians had introduced an alternative, one that did not rely on acceptance of loss, but on the refusal to accept it at all. And that was where the philosophical divide deepened. Yoda remained silent for much of the discussion, his presence calm but contemplative as he listened to the arguments unfold around him. His connection to the Force allowed him to perceive not just the words being spoken, but the currents beneath them, the fear, the uncertainty, the temptation. Because that was what this was. A temptation. Not of the dark side, not of anger or hatred, but of something far more subtle. The temptation to end suffering. To bypass the natural cycle. To win. At last, he spoke, his voice soft but carrying across the chamber with quiet authority. "Power, they possess," Yoda said. "Great power. But understand it, we do not." His gaze moved slowly from one master to another, lingering briefly on Anakin. "Quickly end the war, they might. But consequences, unseen, there may be." That was the heart of it. The unknown. The Guardian's power worked, but it worked in a way that the Jedi could not fully comprehend. It did not align with the Force. It did not follow its principles. And that meant its long-term effects were impossible to predict. Could it disrupt the balance entirely? Could it weaken the Force itself? Or was it something that existed alongside it, neither opposing nor supporting it, but simply different? No one knew. And that uncertainty was enough to divide the Order. Beyond the Council chamber, that division began to manifest among the Jedi themselves. Some, particularly those on the front lines, began to see the Guardians as necessary allies, their presence a means to reduce casualties and protect those who could not defend themselves. Others viewed them with suspicion, wary of relying on a power that defied everything they had been taught. Encounters between Jedi and Guardians became more frequent and more complex. On one world, a Jedi Knight fought alongside a fire team to repel a Separatist assault, their combined efforts turning what would have been a devastating defeat into a hard-fought victory. The Knight could not deny the effectiveness of their methods, nor the lives saved because of them. On another, a different Jedi refused to engage, withdrawing Republic forces rather than risk further exposure to what they perceived as an unnatural influence. There was no unified response. Only choices. And those choices carried weight. For the Guardians, the Jedi's hesitation did not go unnoticed. They were not blind to the way they were observed, the way their presence created tension even among those they fought beside. They understood, in their own way, that they did not belong to this galaxy, not fully. But they also understood something else. People were dying. And they could stop it. That was enough. They did not seek approval. They did not wait for alignment. They continued to act, to intervene, to shape the war in ways that neither Republic nor Separatists could fully control. And in doing so, they forced the Jedi to confront a truth that could no longer be avoided. The war was changing. Not just in strategy. Not just in scale. But in meaning. Because for the first time, the Jedi were faced with a choice that had no clear answer, no path that aligned perfectly with their teachings. To embrace the Guardians was to risk everything they believed about the Force. To reject them was to accept a war that could have been ended sooner. And as the conflict raged on, as more lives were lost and more battles were fought under the shadow of this growing uncertainty, the Order found itself standing at a crossroads. Not between light and dark, but between what they had always believed and what might now be possible. If the Jedi felt uncertainty, the Sith felt opportunity. Where others saw contradiction, Darth Sidious saw inevitability. The Clone Wars had always been his design, a carefully orchestrated conflict meant to erode the Republic, weaken the Jedi, and pave the way for his absolute rule. Every battle, every loss, every victory had been accounted for within a grander vision that extended far beyond the present moment. But the arrival of the Guardians introduced a variable he had not created, and that alone made it dangerous. Not because it threatened his plans directly, but because it represented something he did not yet control. From the highest spires of Coruscant, hidden behind layers of political authority and veiled in the persona of Supreme Chancellor, Sidious observed the unfolding chaos with measured patience. Reports flowed in from across the galaxy, accounts of resurrection, of light manifesting in ways that defied the Force, of ghosts that restored life as though death were merely an inconvenience. Each detail was analyzed, cross-referenced, and stored, not as a curiosity, but as a possibility. Because for all the power the dark side offered, it had always come with limitations. The Sith sought immortality not through harmony, but through domination, binding their essence to the material world, extending their existence through unnatural means. But these methods were flawed. They required constant maintenance, constant control. They were survival, not true transcendence. The Guardians, however, had something different, something cleaner, and that intrigued him. Deep within the shadows of his private sanctum, Sidious began to piece together a new plan, one that diverged from the careful simplicity of the rule of two. This was not about replacing an apprentice or consolidating power within the existing structure. This was about evolution, about transcending the limitations that had defined the Sith for generations. To do that, he needed one thing: a ghost. Not a damaged one, not a fragmented remnant scavenged from a battlefield, but a fully functional construct. One still bound to its guardian, still capable of channeling the light in its purest form. Only then could he understand it, manipulate it, and ultimately corrupt it. The challenge was significant. Guardians did not operate within predictable patterns. They could not be lured easily, nor could they be captured through conventional means. Their ability to resurrect made direct confrontation inefficient, while their ghosts remained elusive, retreating and reappearing with a responsiveness that made them difficult to isolate. But Sidious did not rely on direct confrontation. He relied on manipulation. The first step was information. Through his influence over both Republic and Separatist intelligence networks, he began to track Guardian activity with greater precision, identifying patterns not in their movements, but in their choices. They did not fight randomly. They intervened where conflict reached a certain threshold, where lives were at risk on a scale that demanded their attention. That predictability, subtle as it was, became the foundation of his strategy. The second step was bait. On a world already ravaged by war, a conflict was engineered to escalate beyond its natural progression. Separatist forces were reinforced beyond necessity, their objective not simply to capture territory, but to create a situation so dire that it would draw intervention. Civilian populations were left exposed, their suffering amplified to ensure that the Guardians would take notice. And they did. A fire team arrived as expected, their descent marked by the now familiar distortion of reality itself. They moved quickly, efficiently, their focus on stabilizing the situation, protecting those who could not protect themselves. To them, this was another battlefield, another moment where their presence could make a difference. They did not see the trap. Not at first. The engagement unfolded with calculated precision. Droid forces advanced in overwhelming numbers, their formations designed not just to attack, but to isolate. The Guardians fought as they always did, adaptable, relentless, their light cutting through mechanical ranks with devastating effect. Blaster fire lit the air, explosions rippled across the landscape, and for a time, it seemed as though the outcome would follow the familiar pattern. Until the first Guardian fell. Their ghost appeared instantly, light flaring as it initiated resurrection. And then the Force intervened. Not in defense, but in domination. From the shadows, a presence emerged, suffocating in its intensity, a manifestation of the dark side so overwhelming that it distorted the very air around it. Sidious did not reveal himself openly, not yet, but his influence was undeniable, his will pressing down upon the battlefield with crushing force. The ghost faltered. Its light flickered, unstable, as though encountering resistance it could not fully process. This had never happened before. The Guardian remained down, their body unmoving as the ghost struggled to complete the resurrection process. The delay was brief, mere seconds, but in a battle defined by immediacy, it was enough to shift the momentum. The other Guardians reacted instantly, adjusting their positions, their movements tightening as they recognized the anomaly. They could feel it, not through the Force, but through the disruption itself, an interference that targeted the very core of their existence. And then the strike came. From above, specialized droid units deployed, their targeting systems locked not on the Guardians themselves, but on their ghosts. Heavy weaponry discharged in coordinated bursts, forcing the constructs into evasive maneuvers, disrupting their ability to maintain consistent proximity to their partners. It was not enough to destroy them, but it was enough to isolate one. The chosen ghost was driven back, separated from its guardian by a combination of physical barriers and sustained fire. Its light flared erratically as it attempted to navigate the interference, its systems struggling against a pressure that was both external and something else. Something deeper. That was when Sidious acted directly. Through the Force, he reached out, not to the Guardian, but to the ghost itself. It was not alive in the way organic beings were, but it was not entirely mechanical either. It existed in a space between, its connection to the light making it something unique, something that could be touched, influenced. The contact was immediate and violent. The ghost reacted as though struck, its light surging in response to the intrusion, pushing back against the dark side with a resistance that was instinctive rather than learned. For a moment, the two energies collided, light and dark clashing in a way that neither fully understood. But Sidious was prepared. He did not attempt to overpower it directly. Instead, he adapted, shifting his approach, probing for weaknesses, for points of instability within its structure. The ghost's connection to its guardian, its reliance on proximity, its need to maintain coherence within an environment already hostile to its function, these became vulnerabilities. Slowly, deliberately, he began to exploit them. The ghost's light dimmed. Not extinguished, but strained. Across the battlefield, the remaining guardians felt it, a disruption unlike anything they had experienced before. One of their own was not just in danger, something fundamental was being attacked. Their response was immediate, their focus shifting entirely as they attempted to break through the Separatist lines, to reach the isolated ghost before it was too late. But the trap had been set too well. They could not reach it in time. With a final, concentrated exertion of the dark side, Sidious severed the ghost's connection, not completely, but enough. Its light collapsed inward, its systems locking as it fell into a state of forced dormancy. It did not shatter. It did not vanish. It simply stopped. And in that moment, something unprecedented had occurred. A ghost had been captured. The battlefield did not end there. The remaining guardians fought with renewed intensity, their light burning brighter as they forced a retreat, breaking the Separatist hold on the region and securing the area long enough to regroup. But the objective had already been achieved. The ghost was gone. Taken. And for the first time since their arrival in this galaxy, the Guardians had lost something they could not immediately recover. Far from the battlefield, within the depths of a hidden facility, Sidious stood before his prize. The ghost hovered in containment, its light faint but present, a fragile glow that resisted even in its weakened state. He studied it in silence, his mind already moving beyond the present moment, toward what this meant, what it could become. Because this was only the beginning. The light, once thought to be beyond corruption, had now been touched by the dark side. And if it could be touched, it could be changed. The implications were staggering, not just for the Sith, but for the galaxy itself. Because if Sidious succeeded, if he found a way to bend the light to his will, to merge it with the dark side rather than oppose it, then immortality would no longer be limited to fragile constructs or temporary resurrections. It would become something absolute, something final. And in a war already spiraling beyond control, that possibility loomed like a shadow over everything that had come before. The Guardians had changed the rules of the game. Now, the Sith intended to rewrite them entirely. The moment the ghost was taken, the war changed in a way no one could ignore. What had once been a galaxy-spanning conflict driven by politics, ideology, and manipulation now became something far more dangerous, something that reached beyond fleets and armies into the very nature of existence itself. The balance of the Force, already strained by the prolonged war and the subtle influence of the dark side, began to fracture under a pressure it had never encountered before, as if reality itself were resisting what was being done to it. The first to feel it were the Jedi. Across the galaxy, those attuned to the Force experienced a disturbance unlike any before, not a ripple or a tremor, but a tearing sensation, as though two incompatible truths were being forced together. Meditation became difficult, visions fractured into incoherent fragments, and the clarity that had once guided them in battle was replaced by uncertainty. The Force was still there, still present, but something was interfering with it on a fundamental level. Within the chambers of the Jedi Council, that realization manifested as urgency. The capture of the ghost was no longer just a strategic concern. It was a threat to everything they understood about the Force itself. Masters who had once argued for caution now found themselves confronted with a reality where inaction could lead to consequences far beyond the outcome of the war. This cannot continue, Mace Windu stated, his voice carrying an intensity rarely displayed so openly. Whatever is being done to that construct is affecting the Force. If it is allowed to progress further, the damage may not be reversible. Across from him, Yoda remained still, his eyes closed as he reached out through the Force, attempting to understand what lay beyond the disturbance. But even his perception was clouded, the usual currents of light and dark tangled with something unfamiliar, something that did not belong. Dangerous, this path is, Yoda said quietly. Not only for the Sith, for all life. There was no longer a question of whether the Guardians should be engaged. Now they had to be. Because whatever power they wielded was no longer contained. It had become the center of the conflict. Far from Coruscant, the Guardians had already begun to move. The loss of one of their own had triggered a response unlike any they had shown before. Where they had once acted independently, scattered across different systems, they now converged, drawn together by a shared purpose. Fire teams that had operated separately now coordinated, their movements synchronized with a precision that suggested something deeper than communication. They were not just reacting. They were responding. The light within them burned differently now, not diminished, but focused, as though the very act of losing a ghost had altered their understanding of what they were facing. They could feel the interference, the way the Force and their own power clashed in subtle, destabilizing ways. And they understood, instinctively, that what had been taken could not remain in enemy hands. Because this was not just about recovery. It was about prevention. The location of the captured ghost did not remain hidden for long. The disturbance it created acted like a beacon, drawing attention from across the galaxy. Jedi traced it through the Force, Separatist intelligence identified the concentration of resources around it, and even Republic Command recognized that something significant was unfolding. And at the center of it all stood Darth Sidious, his plan reaching its most critical phase. The facility he had chosen was not random. Hidden within a system near the galactic core, it existed at a convergence point where the Force itself felt unusually potent, a location that amplified both light and dark in equal measure. It was here that he intended to complete his work, to push beyond the boundaries that had defined the Sith for generations and claim something greater. But he was not alone in his pursuit. The Separatists, under the direction of Dooku, moved to secure the system, their fleets forming a defensive perimeter that rivaled any major engagement of the war. Dooku's own ambitions had not diminished. If anything, they had intensified. He understood that whatever Sidious was attempting could redefine power itself, and he had no intention of being excluded from that future. The Republic responded in kind. Led by Jedi generals and reinforced by the full might of the clone army, their fleets advanced toward the system with a singular objective: containment. This was no longer about victory. It was about stopping something that could not be allowed to succeed. And then the Guardians arrived. Their entry was not subtle. Across the void, rifts tore open in rapid succession, dozens of distortions appearing simultaneously as fire teams deployed directly into the heart of the conflict. They did not wait for alignment, did not coordinate with Republic forces or acknowledge Separatist defenses. Their objective was clear, their focus absolute: recover the ghost. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a collision. Republic and Separatist fleets clashed with overwhelming force, capital ships exchanging barrages that lit the void with continuous flashes of destruction. Starfighters weaved through the chaos, their dogfights unfolding against a backdrop of exploding vessels and collapsing shields. The scale of the conflict alone would have been enough to define the war. But within it, something far more volatile was taking place. Guardians moved through the battlefield like living anomalies, their light cutting paths through both sides as they advanced toward the facility at the center of it all. Jedi intercepted them at multiple points, not to stop them, but to understand them, to fight alongside them even as questions remained unanswered. For the first time, there was no hesitation. Because the alternative was worse. On the ground, the convergence became even more intense. Droid armies clashed with clone forces in brutal engagements, their numbers colliding in waves of blaster fire and explosions that reshaped the terrain itself. Above them, Guardians descended directly into the heart of the facility, their objective within reach. And waiting for them was Sidious. He did not hide this time. The moment they entered, the dark side surged outward, a manifestation of power so overwhelming that it warped the environment around him. The captured ghost hovered behind him, its light flickering violently as it resisted the corruption being forced upon it. The air itself seemed to tear, the clash between light, dark, and whatever existed between them pushing reality to its limits. The Guardians advanced. Sidious welcomed them. What followed was not merely a confrontation of strength, but of existence itself. The Guardians unleashed their full power, arc, solar, and void energies colliding with the dark side in a chaotic display that defied conventional understanding. Sidious countered with precision, his mastery of the Force allowing him to anticipate and respond to their attacks, his lightning striking with devastating force. But something unexpected occurred. The light within the ghost reacted, not just to the Guardians, but to Sidious himself. As he attempted to bend it further, to force it into submission, it pushed back with increasing intensity, its energy destabilizing under the strain. The clash between light and dark began to spiral, no longer contained within the ghost, but expanding outward, affecting everything within range. The Force itself responded. Jedi across the battlefield felt it, a surge that was both familiar and alien, as though the Force was attempting to correct something that had gone too far. The Guardians felt it as well, their connection to the light intensifying, their abilities surging beyond their previous limits. Even Sidious felt it, and for the first time, there was resistance he could not fully control. The facility began to collapse under the strain, its structure unable to withstand the energies tearing through it. Outside, the battle intensified as the effects spread, ships caught in the distortion as systems malfunctioned, hyperspace calculations failed, and reality itself seemed to falter. This was no longer just a battle for control. It was a battle for stability. And as the conflict reached its peak, as every faction committed fully to the outcome, one truth became undeniable. If this continued, it would not just decide the war. It would tear the galaxy apart. The moment of collapse did not come as a single, decisive event. It unfolded like a fracture spreading through glass, subtle at first, then unstoppable as the combined forces of light, dark, and something beyond both reached a breaking point. The facility at the heart of the conflict could no longer contain what had been unleashed within it, and as its foundations gave way, the consequences rippled outward across the battlefield with devastating clarity. Inside, the clash between the Guardians and Darth Sidious had already pushed beyond conventional limits. The captured ghost, suspended at the center of the storm, burned with unstable brilliance, its light no longer flickering weakly but surging violently in response to the opposing forces acting upon it. Sidious had sought to dominate it, to bend its power into something that would elevate him beyond the constraints of the Sith, but what he had encountered instead was resistance that refused to conform. Not just defiance. Correction. The light was not meant to be controlled. And as that realization began to manifest, the consequences became unavoidable. The Guardians, moving as one despite their individual autonomy, reached the final threshold of the chamber. Their movements were no longer just tactical, they were purposeful in a way that transcended strategy. Each action, each surge of power, aligned toward a singular objective, to restore what had been broken before the damage became irreversible. Sidious saw it, understood it, and for the first time, he adjusted not out of calculation, but necessity. The dark side surged around him, its power expanding in a desperate attempt to maintain control over the ghost, to complete what he had begun before it slipped beyond his grasp. Lightning arced outward in violent streams, striking the advancing Guardians, forcing them back momentarily as the air itself burned with destructive energy. But the Guardians did not retreat. They endured. Even as their bodies fell under the intensity of the assault, their ghosts responded instantly, light flaring as they resurrected again and again, their persistence forming a rhythm that could not be broken. Where Sidious relied on domination, they relied on continuity. Where he sought to impose his will, they simply continued. And that difference began to matter, because the Force itself was reacting. Across the battlefield, Yoda felt the shift first, his connection allowing him to perceive what others could not. The disturbance that had once felt like a tearing began to change, not stabilizing, but transforming. The Force was not rejecting the light of the Guardians. It was adapting to it. Change, this is, Yoda murmured, his voice barely audible even to those closest to him. Not destruction. Beside him, Mace Windu remained focused on the battle, but even he could sense it now, the way the currents of the Force were shifting, adjusting to accommodate something that had once seemed entirely alien. The implication was staggering, because it meant that the Guardian's power was not breaking the Force. It was becoming part of it. Inside the collapsing chamber, that transformation reached its peak. The captured ghost, pushed beyond its limits by the opposing forces acting upon it, began to change. Its light expanded outward, no longer contained within its physical form, but extending into the surrounding space in a wave of energy that resonated with both the Guardians and the Force itself. It was not an explosion. It was a release. Sidious reacted instantly, attempting to contain it, to draw it back under his control, but this time, the resistance was absolute. The light did not bend. It did not yield. It expanded, enveloping the chamber, the facility, and beyond, its influence spreading outward in a ripple that touched everything within range. The Guardians stepped into it. And in doing so, they completed what they had come to do. The ghost was no longer separate. It was restored. Not just repaired, but reconnected, its bond with its guardian re-established in a way that transcended physical limitation. The light stabilized, its chaotic fluctuations resolving into something coherent, something balanced, not opposing the Force, but existing alongside it. Sidious felt it slip from his grasp. For a brief moment, something unfamiliar passed through him. Not fear, but recognition. This was not a power he could claim. And in that realization, he withdrew. Not in defeat, but in calculation. The battle had shifted beyond what he could control in this moment, and survival, continuation, remained his priority. With a final surge of the dark side, he created distance, his presence receding as the chamber collapsed entirely, leaving the Guardians standing at the center of something entirely new. Outside, the effects were immediate. The distortion that had plagued the battlefield began to dissipate, the instability resolving as the light settled into its new state. Ships regained control, hyperspace calculations stabilized, and the chaotic interference that had threatened to tear reality apart receded. The battle did not end instantly, but it changed. Republic and Separatist forces, once locked in total engagement, began to disengage, their focus shifting from destruction to survival as the scale of what had nearly occurred became clear. Even Dooku, observing from afar, recognized the shift, his ambitions recalibrating in response to a reality that had just been fundamentally altered. The Guardians did not pursue. They did not press the advantage. Instead, they withdrew. Not in retreat, but in completion. Their objective had been achieved, their purpose fulfilled, and as they departed the battlefield, their presence left behind something that could not be undone. A new understanding. For the Jedi, that understanding came with both clarity and unease. The Guardians had not corrupted the Force. They had not destroyed its balance. They had expanded it, introducing a dimension that had never been considered, a way of interacting with life and death that did not rely solely on the principles the Jedi had followed for generations. This did not invalidate their beliefs, but it challenged them, because it proved that the Force was not the only path. For the Sith, the lesson was different. Sidious had sought to dominate the light, to claim it as an extension of his own power, and in doing so, he had encountered something that could not be bent to his will. It was not a defeat in the traditional sense, but it was a limitation, a boundary that even he could not cross. And that was something he would not forget. As the war continued in the days that followed, its nature had changed irrevocably. The Guardians remained, their presence no longer a mystery, but a factor that every faction had to consider. They did not control the war, but they influenced it in ways that could not be predicted, their actions guided by a purpose that extended beyond victory or defeat. They had redefined what it meant to fight, what it meant to die, and what it meant to return. The galaxy would never be the same, because now existed a truth that neither Jedi nor Sith could ignore. The Force was not the only answer, and destiny was no longer fixed. In the aftermath of the battle for the core, the galaxy stood on the edge of something entirely new, a fragile equilibrium formed not through victory, but through understanding. The Clone Wars did not end that day, nor did the conflict between light and dark suddenly resolve itself into peace. But something fundamental had shifted, something that would echo far beyond the final battlefields of the war. The Guardians did not claim territory, nor did they establish dominion over systems or governments. They did not seek to replace the Jedi or challenge the Sith in the traditional sense. Instead, they remained what they had always been, agents of intervention, beings who acted when necessary and withdrew when their purpose was complete. But their presence had altered the galaxy in ways that could not be reversed. For the Jedi, the revelation was profound. They had spent generations believing that the Force was the ultimate guiding principle of existence, that balance could only be achieved through its understanding and adherence. But now, they had witnessed something that existed alongside it, something that neither opposed nor obeyed the Force, but complemented it in ways they had never imagined. The idea that life and death were not absolute, that there were forces beyond their teachings, forced them to confront a reality they were never meant to face. For the Sith, the lesson was equally transformative, though far less accepted. Darth Sidious had glimpsed a power that could not be dominated, a form of immortality that did not bend to the will of the dark side. It was not a failure, but it was a limitation, and for a Sith, limitations were challenges to be overcome. The pursuit of that power would not end, it would evolve. And for the galaxy itself, the implications were endless. War would continue. Empires would rise and fall. The struggle between light and dark would persist as it always had. But now, there was something more, an unknown variable that could not be fully understood or controlled. The Guardians had not just entered the Star Wars galaxy. They had changed its destiny. And somewhere, beyond the stars, beyond the Force, something watched, something that had sent them here or allowed them to cross between realities. Whether it would remain silent or act again was a question no one could answer. Because the greatest truth revealed in this conflict was not about power. It was about possibility. In a galaxy once defined by the Force, a new path had emerged, one that defied expectation, challenged belief, and proved that even in a universe bound by destiny, there were still things that could change everything.
The multiverse doesn't end here. New invasions, new empires, and new worlds collide daily. If you enjoy deep cinematic what-if scenarios like this, subscribe and join Multiverse Galaxy if